She waited 3 days at the station. 3 days of wind that tasted like dust and promises turning to ash in her mouth. The paper she clutched in her hand, the one signed by a man named Ezra Whitlow, felt like a ghost. A phantom promise of a ranch, a life, a future in a town called Dustmere, Wyoming. But according to the station master, a man with eyes as faded as his overalls, there was no Ezra Whitlow. Never was. Day 1 was spent on a bench too short for sleep, watching the sun burn a hole in the sky. Day 2, she ate the last of her bread, the crusts hard as rock, and listened to the townfolk whisper as they passed. "Another one?" a woman said by the well. "Third this year. Poor thing." Barbara didn't cry. She was too proud, too tired. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. By the morning of day 3, even the kindly station master looked at her with pity. He brought her tea and a warning. "Some boys round here got a mean streak," he mumbled. "Fake bride letters. Happened twice last fall. Those girls left on the next train." The tea was bitter, but she drank it. She was ready to leave too. Ready to board the next train east and pretend Dustmere was just a bad dream. She stood, brushing the grime from her skirt, her journey over before it had even begun. She'd ask when the next train was, and then she'd disappear. Just another forgotten woman on a forgotten platform. But then she felt a tug, a small, insistent pull on the hem of her dress. She looked down. A little girl, no older than 5, stood there. Her boots were too big for her feet. Her braids were laced with dust, and her eyes were serious, like chips of flint. The girl didn't smile. She just looked up at Barbara, a long, searching look. "Are you the lady who got left?" she asked, her voice clear as a bell. Barbara almost laughed at the bluntness of it. "Yes," she managed, "but I think I'm done being that lady." The girl tilted her head, considering this. She took a step closer. "Good," she said, as if a decision had been made. "Will you marry my daddy instead?" Barbara froze, the world tilting on its axis. The wind stopped. The whispers died. The only thing she could hear was the beat of her own stunned heart. What?" The girl's expression didn't change. "He lives out there," she said, pointing a small, dirt-smudged finger toward the distant hills. "He needs someone. I think you're someone." Before Barbara could form a single word of protest, a question, anything, the little girl's hand shot out and grabbed hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Come on," she ordered. "I'm not supposed to be in town alone. You have to walk with me." Barbara was being pulled, led away from the station, away from the train that was supposed to be her escape. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Who was this child? Who was her father? "Who is your daddy?" she asked, stumbling to keep up. The girl glanced back over her shoulder. "Thomas Callahan," she said. "He says he doesn't need a wife. But I don't think anyone's ever asked him right." Barbara looked at the small hand holding hers, the first real warmth she'd felt in 3 days. After the lies, the humiliation, the crushing loneliness of that bench, what was one more gamble? What did she have left to lose? So she followed. She followed the little girl in the 2 big boots away from the town and into the fading light, toward a life she never asked for, and a man who didn't want her. The Callahan Ranch was less a home and more a monument to stubborn survival. The house stood against the wind, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The barn leaned, as if tired of standing straight. As they approached, a man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the unforgiving Wyoming rock. His eyes, dark and deep-set, took in the sight of his daughter holding a strange woman's hand. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his movements slow, deliberate. Maisie, the little girl, ran ahead. "Daddy, I brought someone." The man's eyes flicked from Maisie to Barbara, and his expression didn't soften. It didn't change at all. There was no welcome there, no curiosity, just a flat, hard emptiness. "I didn't send for a wife," he said. His voice was gravel, low and final. Barbara felt the familiar sting of rejection, but this time, something else rose with it. Defiance. She clutched her worn carpet bag, lifted her chin, and met his gaze. "Then maybe someone else sent me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She nodded toward Maisie, who was now hiding behind her father's legs, peeking out at Barbara. For her. For the briefest of moments, a flicker of something passed through Thomas Callahan's eyes. A crack in the stone. It wasn't a smile, not even close, but it was enough. But it was the first sign that underneath the grief and the silence, there was a man still capable of feeling something. Barbara had every intention of leaving at sunrise. The cot Thomas Callahan had grudgingly offered was hard, the blanket was thin, and the silence in the house was a living thing, so loud it rang in her ears. She lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, her bag already packed by the door. She was a teacher, not a rancher's wife. She was an inconvenience, a stray brought home by a hopeful child. She would be gone before the sun was fully up. One more rejection was nothing new. But as she stepped into the cool, dark hallway, a sound stopped her. A soft, wheezing cough from Maisie's room. Then a tiny, hoarse voice. "Miss Barbara?" She found the little girl curled in her doorway, her face flushed, her eyes glassy with fever. "I feel icky," Maisie whimpered, trying hard not to cry. Barbara knelt, her plan to flee dissolving in an instant. She touched Maisie's forehead. It was burning. Without a second thought, she scooped the child into her arms. She'd never held a child before, but Maisie wrapped her arms around her neck and clung to her as if she'd been doing it her whole life. She carried her back to bed just as Thomas appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound. His jaw was tight. "She's sick?" he asked, his voice flat, stating a fact rather than asking a question. Barbara nodded. "A fever." He crossed the room and leaned over the bed, his large frame casting a shadow over his daughter. Maisie, half delirious, whimpered and reached not for her father, but for Barbara. Thomas saw it. He saw his daughter, who shied away from everyone, reach for this complete stranger. The stone in his face shifted, just slightly. "She wants you," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "She never takes to strangers." Barbara smoothed the thin blanket over Maisie's small body. "Then maybe I'll stay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Just until she's better." Thomas hesitated. A war seemed to be fighting behind his eyes. Finally, he gave a single curt nod. "There's broth in the pantry," he said, already turning away. "If you know what you're doing." He didn't wait for an answer. He just left, leaving her alone with his sick child. That set the tone for the days that followed. Barbara stayed, not for the silent, grieving man, but for the little girl who held her hand while she slept. She learned the rhythms of the ranch. Her hands, once soft from holding books, became blistered from pumping water. Her back ached from weeding the garden. She was clumsy, awkward, a creature of the city dropped into the wild. But she didn't stop. Maisie was sick for 2 more days. Barbara read to her from an old, worn Bible she found on a shelf, not for the scripture, but for the steady, calming rhythm of the words. Maisie would listen, her eyes heavy, her small hand always clutching a piece of Barbara's sleeve. Thomas remained a ghost in his own home. He came and went with the sun, speaking only in short, clipped instructions. "Boil water." "Watch the stove." "More hay." He never used her name, but she felt his eyes on her. When she was sewing a patch onto one of Maisie's worn-out nightgowns, she glanced up and caught him watching from the doorway before he quickly turned away. When she stirred the broth, She saw his gaze linger on the bowl as he passed. He never said thank you, never acknowledged the work she was doing. But on the third night, something changed. Barbara had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, exhausted, a pile of mending in her lap. The candle had burned low, its light soft on her face. Thomas came in from the barn, smelling of cold air and hay. He stopped. He stood there for a long time, just looking at her. Then, moving with a quietness that seemed impossible for a man his size, he took the thick wool blanket from the rocking chair and gently draped it over her shoulders. His hand hovered for a second near her hair, then pulled back as if burned. He blew out the candle, plunging the room into the soft glow of the firelight. As he turned to leave, he paused at the threshold and looked back one last time. His face was unreadable in the shadows, but his eyes weren't empty anymore. He was watching her the way a man watches something he thought he'd lost forever. The whispers in town were like flies, buzzing around her every time she went for supplies. "She's still out there," she heard a woman say at the general store. "The third one. Wonder how long she'll last." Another woman, Miss Ellie, the one who always seemed to be watching, added with a sad shake of her head, "I heard the last one left in the middle of the night. Cried herself sick, poor dear." Barbara ignored them. She smiled at the clerk, paid for her flour and salt, and walked out with her head held high. She had faced worse than gossip. But the words stuck to her, heavy and sharp. She wasn't his wife. She wasn't a governess. She was just there. A temporary fixture in a house haunted by a ghost. The ghost's name was Mary. One afternoon, while she was gathering eggs, she saw Thomas fixing a loose shutter on the porch. Maisie was dozing in a small chair nearby, her thumb close to her mouth. In her sleep, the little girl sighed a single, heartbreaking word. "Mama." Thomas froze. The hammer in his hand lowered slowly. His shoulders slumped. Without a word, he set the tool down and walked back into the house, the screen door slamming shut behind him, a sound as final as a gunshot. That night, supper was silent. Not the usual quiet, but a thick, suffocating silence. Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared down at his plate, pushing his food around. Barbara knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't live in the shadow of a memory she could never compete with. She was a placeholder, and the real owner of this house, this family, was a woman she'd never met. That night, she packed her bag in the dark. She folded her apron and left it on the chair. She wrote a short note. "Thank you for letting me be here." She didn't sleep. She just lay on the hard cot, listening to the wind howl outside, a lonely, mournful sound. She rose before dawn, determined to be gone before anyone woke. But when she stepped into the kitchen, he was already there. Thomas stood at the stove, his back to her. He was holding Maisie, who was still half asleep, her head resting on his shoulder as he spooned porridge into a bowl. Barbara's heart stopped. He didn't turn around. "I thought you were leaving," he said, his voice low. "I am," she whispered. He set the bowl down and walked not to her, but to the chair she always sat in at the table. He draped her blue shawl over the back of it. Not the stool, not the bench. Her chair. Then he went back to the stove and stirred the porridge. Barbara took a tentative step forward, her fingers brushing against the soft wool of her shawl. He still wouldn't look at her. "Maisie likes your stories," he said quietly. Her breath hitched. "And you?" There was a long pause. "I like that she smiles," he finally said. Barbara sank into the chair, her hands trembling. "You didn't ask me to stay." He finally turned, and his eyes, for the first time, were clear. The grief was still there, but it wasn't a wall anymore. It was just a scar. "I didn't know how," he said. And that was it. The first truth they had ever shared. It wasn't love. It wasn't a promise. It was just a beginning. But what Barbara didn't know was that some beginnings are born from terrible endings, and that the whispers in town weren't just gossip. They were warnings. The last girl hadn't just cried herself sick. She had left screaming, her face pale with terror, swearing the ranch was cursed. Cursed by a ghost who didn't want anyone to take her place. It was nearly dusk a few weeks later when Barbara opened the wrong drawer. She was looking for a clean towel for Maisie, who had managed to get covered in mud from head to toe. "The linen drawer," she muttered, pulling open the bottom drawer of the old dresser near the fireplace. But her fingers didn't find soft cloth. They brushed against hard, splintered wood. Curious, she pulled out a small, worn box. The hinges were rusted, the corners rubbed smooth. She shouldn't have opened it. It was his. It was private. But she did. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed linen, were letters. Dozens of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. All written in the same careful, looping hand. And all addressed to a woman named Mary. His wife. Her heart ached for him, for the depth of a love that would compel a man to keep writing to his dead wife. She was about to close the box, to put it back and pretend she'd never seen it, when one letter, tucked beneath the others, caught her eye. It was different. The paper was newer, the ink darker. And it wasn't a letter. It was a single folded page, torn from a journal. The handwriting was his, but it was frantic, jagged. "She was here again," it read, "watching the house from the ridge, the same way she watched before the accident. I told the sheriff, but he thinks I'm crazy with grief. He doesn't believe me. He doesn't know what she's capable of. Mary knew. Mary was afraid of her." Barbara's blood ran cold. Accident? Watching the house? Who was she? This wasn't a letter of grief. It was a letter of fear. She was still holding the page, her mind reeling, when Thomas walked in. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes locking onto the open box in her hands. His face, which had slowly begun to soften over the weeks, turned back into stone. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "That's not yours," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wasn't looking for it. I was just—" "I don't need help with this," he cut her off, taking a step forward, his shadow falling over her. He wasn't just sad. He was angry. He was terrified. "You think you know what it's like?" he said, his voice tight with a pain that went deeper than loss. "To watch your whole world burn and not be able to prove who lit the match?" His words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Lit the match? This wasn't about an accident. This was about something else. Something he was hiding. "Thomas," she began, but he shook his head, looking away. He ran a hand over his face, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Just put it back," he rasped. "Pretend you never saw it." He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. Barbara slowly, carefully, folded the page and placed it back in the box. She closed the lid, the soft click echoing in the silent room. She realized then that the ghost haunting this ranch wasn't his dead wife. It was a living one. And Thomas Callahan wasn't just grieving. He was afraid. Afraid of a woman who was still out there, still watching. A woman who had already taken one wife from him and seemed determined to make sure he never had another. Barbara packed her bag in silence. This time it felt different. She wasn't leaving because she felt unwanted or out of place. She was leaving because she was scared. The words from his journal page echoed in her mind. She was here again, watching the house. The whispers from the town took on a new, sinister meaning. The girl who left screaming. What had she seen? What had happened to her? Barbara looked over at Maisie, sleeping peacefully in her small bed, oblivious to the darkness that clung to the corners of her home. How could she protect this child? How could she stay in a place where the danger was a secret no one would speak aloud? The sun had not yet risen when she stepped into the kitchen, her bag in hand. And just like before, he was there, waiting. He stood by the stove, not making coffee, not doing anything. Just standing there, a sentinel in the pre-dawn gloom. He didn't have to ask. He saw the bag. He saw the resolve in her eyes. His face was a mask of exhaustion. "So this is it," he said, his voice rough with unshed emotion. "I can't stay here, Thomas," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. I can't fight a ghost I can't see." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, helpless despair. "Her name is Ellie," he said, the words tasting like poison. "Miss Ellie from the general store. She was Mary's cousin. She always wanted this place. She always wanted me." The truth, when it came, was uglier than anything Barbara could have imagined. After Mary died, she was here all the time, helping. But I saw the way she looked at me. The way she looked at any woman who even spoke to me. The two before you. She drove them away. Left a dead snake on one's pillow. Told the other that Mary's spirit would never let her rest here. Barbara stared at him, horrified. "Why didn't you tell the sheriff?" "He's her brother," Thomas said, a bitter, hollow sound. "He says I'm just a grieving husband seeing things. That I'm mad. No one believes me." Barbara's heart clenched. He wasn't just a grieving man. He was a prisoner, trapped on his own land by a woman obsessed and a town that wouldn't listen. She understood now. The coldness, the silence. It was armor. It was the only way he knew how to protect himself and his daughter. She put her bag down, but before she could speak, Maisie was there, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She saw Barbara, then her bag. Her little face crumpled. "No," she whispered. "Please don't go." She ran to Barbara and wrapped her arms around her legs, clinging to her. "Please," she sobbed. "Don't let her get us." The child's words, full of a fear no 5-year-old should ever know, broke something inside Barbara. Footsteps thundered on the porch. She looked up just as Thomas reached her, his face wrecked with a pain that was more than just grief. It was the terror of a man about to lose everything all over again. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, his voice raw. "She's not the only one who doesn't want you to leave," he said. "I don't know what this is. I just know it hurts when you're not in the room." Barbara reached down and stroked Maisie's hair, her gaze locked with Thomas's. "I don't need promises," she said softly. "Good," he replied, his voice cracking. "I don't have any, just reasons to ask you to stay." She looked at the man who had been broken by secrets and the child who was terrified of them. And she knew she couldn't leave. She couldn't abandon them to the mercy of a monster hiding in plain sight. She wasn't just a mail-order bride who'd been stood up anymore. She was a fighter, and her fight was here. As she stepped forward, dropping her bag for the final time, the sky outside began to brighten. But on the distant ridge overlooking the ranch, a lone figure stood watching the house, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. The storm rolled in with the fury of a vengeful god. The wind howled, tearing at the house, and rain lashed against the windows in blinding sheets. Inside, Barbara held Maisie tight, humming a lullaby to drown out the thunder. Thomas moved through the small cabin, checking shutters, his face grim. The air was electric, charged with more than just the storm. A sense of dread had settled over them, cold and heavy. Then, through the roar of the wind, came a different sound. A sharp, sickening crack, followed by a deep, guttural whoomph that shook the very floorboards. Barbara's head snapped up. Through the rain-streaked window she saw it, an angry orange glow painting the night sky. "The barn!" she breathed, her voice filled with horror. Before Thomas could even shout her name, she had thrown on her shawl and was out the door, plunging into the tempest. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to pull her down, but she kept running. The barn was already an inferno. Flames licked at the roof, reaching for the storm-tossed sky like greedy fingers. Sparks flew on the wind, a deadly confetti threatening the rest of the ranch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The mare. Their only horse was still inside. Thomas was right behind her, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "Barbara, are you insane? Get back inside!" he roared over the wind. "The mare!" she screamed back, not stopping. She reached the huge barn doors, the wood already hot to the touch, and yanked them open. A wall of heat and smoke hit her, stealing her breath. The air was thick, black, choking. Through the swirling chaos, she could see the terrified horse, trapped behind a fallen, burning beam, its eyes wide with panic. Thomas was beside her in an instant. "The beam! Together!" he yelled. They grabbed the scorched timber, the heat searing through their clothes. Their muscles screamed in protest, their lungs burned, but they lifted. Grunting with the effort, they heaved the massive piece of wood, just enough for the horse to scramble free. The mare bolted past them, a blur of brown terror, and galloped out into the relative safety of the rain-soaked pasture. But the barn was groaning, the structure beginning to collapse. "Leave it! It's too late!" Thomas yelled, grabbing her arm, trying to pull her away. But Barbara saw something else. Near the back wall, where the flames were thickest, was a pile of oil-soaked rags. This wasn't the storm. This wasn't lightning. This was deliberate. "It was her!" Barbara coughed, pointing a soot-covered finger. "She did this!" A new kind of strength, born of pure rage, surged through her. They couldn't save the barn, but they could stop the fire from spreading to the house. They worked like demons, hauling buckets of water from the trough, throwing them on the greedy flames that were already starting to lick at the woodshed. They fought the fire and the storm for what felt like an eternity, soaked to the bone, covered in ash, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. By the time the last embers hissed and died in the mud, the eastern sky was beginning to bleed with the first light of dawn. The barn was a skeletal ruin, black and steaming in the morning mist. Barbara collapsed to her knees, her body finally giving out. Thomas knelt beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Let me see your hands," he said, his voice low. She didn't argue. She held them out. They were red, raw, blistered from the heat and the rough wood of the buckets. He took them gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft as he examined the burns. "You shouldn't have run out here alone," he murmured. "You'd have done the same," she whispered. He looked up, and his eyes met hers in the gray light. "Yes," he admitted, "but I've already lost too much. I couldn't bear to—" He stopped, but he didn't have to finish. She knew. He pulled a strip of cloth from his pocket and began to carefully wrap one of her hands. His touch was so gentle it made her want to cry. When he finished with the first, he took her other hand, but he didn't wrap it right away. He just held it, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. His hand didn't let go. He stared at her burned hands resting in his. "You stayed," he said, his voice barely audible over the chirping of the first morning birds. "When no one else did." She didn't respond with words. Instead, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. They stayed like that for a long moment, kneeling in the mud and ash, the ruins of their barn smoldering beside them. In the silence, a bond was forged, stronger than steel, tempered in fire and fear. But as Thomas finally let go of her hand to help her stand, his eyes caught something on the ground near where the oil-soaked rags had been. A small, muddy footprint, too small to be his. And next to it, snagged on a splinter of wood, was a tiny scrap of dark green fabric, the exact same color as the shawl Miss Ellie wore to church every Sunday. The kitchen smelled of pine oil and resolve. Barbara had scrubbed every surface, as if trying to wash away the soot and the fear of the night before. The table was set for a meal they wouldn't eat. Maisie was sitting quietly in the corner, drawing a picture of a house with a big fence around it. A safe house. Thomas stood by the window, staring out at the charred skeleton of the barn. In his hand, he held the muddy scrap of green fabric. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd found it. The silence was different now. It wasn't born of grief, but of cold, hard fury. "We can't just sit here," Barbara said finally, her voice low but steady. "We have to do something." Thomas turned from the window. The emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dangerous fire. "She's not going to get away with it," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not this time." He looked at Barbara, then at his daughter. "This ends today." They rode into town not in their Sunday best, but in their dirt-stained work clothes, their faces still smudged with ash. They looked like warriors returning from a battle. Barbara held Maisie in front of her on the saddle, the child's small arms wrapped around her waist. Thomas rode beside them, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the town ahead. They didn't stop at the sheriff's office. They knew it would be useless. They rode straight to the general store. The bell above the door jingled as they walked in. The store was busy, filled with the usual morning customers. And behind the counter, folding bolts of calico, was Miss Ellie. She looked up, a polite, practiced smile on her face. The smile faltered when she saw them. She saw their clothes, their faces, the fury in Thomas's eyes. "Thomas, Barbara," she said, her voice a little too bright. "What on earth happened to you two? You look like you've been through a war." Thomas walked right up to the counter and slammed the green scrap of fabric down. It lay there, small and damning, on the polished wood. "Our barn burned down last night," he said, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent store. "Someone set the fire." Miss Ellie's face went pale. "Oh, my heavens, that's terrible. An accident, I presume. The storm—" "It was no accident, Ellie," Barbara said, stepping forward. "We found this snagged on the wood next to the kindling. Every eye in the store was on them now. The whispers had stopped." Miss Ellie looked at the scrap of fabric, then back at them, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. I don't know what you're implying. That little scrap could be from anywhere." "Could it?" Thomas said, his voice dropping even lower. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded yellowed page from his journal. The page Barbara had found. He unfolded it. "This is a page from my journal, written the week before my wife died. It says how Mary was afraid of you, Ellie. How she saw you watching the house. How you were obsessed." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Miss Ellie's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. That's a lie. You're mad with grief. Everyone knows that." "Am I?" Thomas challenged, his voice rising. "What about the other women, Ellie? The ones you scared away? What did you do to them? Did you leave dead things on their pillows? Did you whisper ghost stories in the dark? Did you do whatever it took to keep me alone? To keep me miserable? To keep me for yourself?" The truth was out, raw and ugly, filling the store, sucking all the air out of the room. Miss Ellie's face twisted, the mask of the concerned neighbor melting away to reveal the jealous, hateful woman beneath. "She was never good enough for you!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Barbara. "None of them were! This ranch should have been mine! You should have been mine! Mary was weak! She didn't deserve you!" In her rage, she confessed to everything. She admitted to spooking Mary's horse, causing the accident that had killed her. She admitted to writing the fake Ezra Whitlow letters, a cruel game to lure hopeful women to Dustmere, only so she could terrorize them and watch them flee, proving to Thomas that no one else would ever have him. She admitted to setting the fire, a final, desperate act to destroy what she couldn't possess. The townspeople stared, horrified, as the woman they had known their whole lives, the woman who served them their sugar and flour, revealed herself to be a monster. Her own brother, the sheriff, stood in the doorway, having been drawn by the commotion, his face ashen as he listened to his sister's venomous confession. There was no denying it now, no hiding behind claims of a grieving man's madness. The justice Thomas had been denied for years had finally arrived, not in a courtroom, but in the middle of the general store, delivered by the woman he had finally allowed himself to let in. 1 year later, the Callahan Ranch was unrecognizable. A new barn stood tall and proud where the old one had fallen, built with the help of the very townspeople who had once whispered behind their hands. Laughter, not silence, echoed through the small house. A flower box, overflowing with bright red geraniums, sat on the windowsill, a stubborn splash of color against the Wyoming dust. In the kitchen, Barbara flipped pancakes, while Maisie, now 6, drew pictures at the table, her charcoal-smudged fingers creating a world of happy stick figures holding hands. Thomas came in from the fields, his boots muddy, and without a word, wrapped his arms around Barbara from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as he watched the pancakes sizzle. It was a simple, easy gesture, one that still made Barbara's heart feel full to bursting when she remembered the stone-faced man she had first met. After breakfast, Thomas stood by the mantel, staring at the empty, dusty frame that had hung there for years. He took it down, carefully wiping the glass. "I was thinking," he said, turning to Barbara. "It's time we put something new in here." A week later, they rode into town, this time in their Sunday best. Barbara wore a blue dress that matched her eyes. Maisie had ribbons in her hair. Thomas wore a clean shirt that felt strange and stiff. At the photographer's studio, they posed for their first family portrait. Thomas stood behind Barbara's chair, his hand resting on her shoulder. Maisie sat on Barbara's lap, her arm draped around her mother's neck. When the photographer told them to hold still, Thomas squeezed her shoulder gently. The click of the shutter felt like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. The photograph arrived wrapped in brown paper. Barbara opened it with trembling fingers. There they were, 3 people, a family. Not perfect, not unscarred, but whole. That evening, after Maisie was asleep, Barbara sat by the fire. She pulled out the old wooden box, the one filled with Thomas's unsent letters to Mary. She didn't read them. Instead, she gently placed the new photograph inside, on top of the old pages, a testament to a love that had been born from the ashes of another. Then she took out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. She began to write. "Dear Barbara," she wrote, "you came to this town expecting to be a wife. You thought you were forgotten on a train platform, another broken promise in a long line of them. But you were not forgotten. You were being sent to a little girl who needed a mother, to a man who needed someone to believe him, to a home that needed its ghosts chased away for good. You were not a mistake. You were an answer. And now you are not waiting. You are home." She signed it, not Barbara Hart, but Barbara Callahan. Later, as she and Thomas sat on the porch, watching the stars blanket the vast, dark sky, he turned to her. "You ever think about what might have happened if Ezra Whitlow had been real?" he asked. Barbara laughed, a warm, happy sound that the wind carried away into the night. "I think about what would have happened if a little girl in boots that were too big hadn't been brave enough to ask a stranger to marry her daddy." Thomas kissed her temple. "Smartest one of us," he murmured. She leaned her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "The best matchmaker I've ever met," she agreed. And in the quiet comfort of that shared moment, the last of the shadows finally faded, leaving only the warm glow of the porch light, a small beacon in the wilderness that promised no one here would ever wait alone again. If you enjoyed this story of love, loss, and long-awaited justice, and you believe that sometimes home isn't a place you find, but something you build, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
We share new tales of courage and romance from the Wild West every week. Like this video, share it with someone who loves a good story, and we'll see you on the next Dusty Trail.